The morning sun was just peeking through the blinds when Sophie sat quietly in her small apartment, holding a steaming mug of coffee between her hands. The smell of roasted beans filled the air, calming her nerves a little. Today was a big day for her first day working at her family's company. But this wasn't an ordinary new job. This was a plan she'd been thinking about for months, maybe even years. Most people in her position would walk straight into a corner office, sit behind a big desk, and start making decisions. But Sophie wasn't like most people. Her father was one of the founders of HOA Industries, a mid-sized company that had grown rapidly over the past decade. They were known for their quality work, loyal staff, and family-like culture. At least that's what the company brochures said, but Sophie wasn't sure if that was still true. After finishing her degree abroad, she had heard mixed things about how the company was being run. Some employees said management had changed. Others said that things weren't as fair or friendly anymore. Her father, now semi-retired, still attended board meetings, but he had left much of the daily operations to a few trusted managers. Sophie wanted to see for herself what was really going on, not as the co-owner's daughter, but as an ordinary worker, so she made a quiet arrangement with the HR department and used her mother's maiden name on her application. On paper, she was just Sophie Allen, a young woman with a decent education and some experience from overseas. HR agreed to keep her true identity confidential. They thought it was a clever idea, too. As she got dressed that morning, a simple blouse, black slacks, and comfortable shoes, she reminded herself to blend in, to observe, to learn. She didn't want any special treatment. She wanted the truth. The bus ride to the office was short, but gave her enough time to feel her nerves bubbling again. She had gone over her story a dozen times in her head. What she'd say if someone asked why she applied, how she'd explain her work experience, what she'd do if things got uncomfortable. She told herself that she could handle it. After all, she'd dealt with tougher challenges while studying abroad. When she arrived, the building looked as impressive as she remembered. Tall glass windows reflected the morning light, and the logo she had seen her father design years ago still stood proudly at the entrance. She smiled for a second. There was a sense of pride, but also curiosity. How much had changed behind those shiny doors? At the reception desk, a cheerful young woman greeted her. "Good morning. You must be the new hire, right?" Sophie nodded. "Yes, that's me. Sophie Allen. Great. Let me call the floor manager for you. You'll be starting in the administrative department." Sophie thanked her and waited, clutching her small bag nervously. She glanced around the lobby. A few employees were rushing in with their coffee cups, some chatting, some focused on their phones. Everyone seemed busy, but there was also a certain tension in the air. That quiet pressure that often lingers in workplaces where people are afraid to make mistakes. A few minutes later, a tall man in his late 30s approached her. He was wearing an expensive suit and his expression was confident, maybe a little too confident. "You must be Sophie," he said with a half smile. "I'm Mark, the regional manager here. Welcome to HOA Industries." "Thank you," she said politely. He looked her up and down quickly, not in a rude way but with the kind of judgment managers often have when sizing up a new employee. "You'll be reporting to me for now. Let's get you settled." As they walked through the office, Sophie noticed that several employees seemed to sit up straighter when Mark passed by. Some even avoided making eye contact. He carried himself like someone who enjoyed being in charge, maybe too much. "This is a busy department," Mark said, walking briskly. "We handle client communication, scheduling, and coordination with the sales team. I expect everyone here to be efficient and professional. No excuses." Sophie nodded, keeping her expression neutral. He led her to a small cubicle near the back of the room. "You'll be working here for now. We'll see how you perform before we assign more responsibility." "I understand," she said softly. "Good." Mark glanced at his watch. "I'll have someone show you the system later. Just don't bother people too much, okay? Everyone's got work to do." He gave her a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and walked away. Sophie exhaled slowly. It was clear he wasn't the friendliest person, but she had met worse. Still, she couldn't help but notice how stiff everyone seemed after he left. It was as if the entire room had been holding its breath while he was there. A kind-looking woman sitting nearby turned in her chair and smiled at Sophie. "Don't worry about him, he's intense, let's just say." Sophie chuckled softly. I noticed. I'm Lena, the woman said. If you need help with anything, I've got you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Lena quickly showed Sophie how to log into the company system and access files. She explained who handled what and gave her a few tips on how to stay on Mark's good side. He likes things done fast. And he hates when people ask too many questions, she whispered with a little laugh. Sophie nodded, listening carefully. She wanted to understand everything about this place, the work, the people, and especially the culture that had formed under Mark's leadership. The first few hours went by smoothly. Sophie reviewed client files, organized some reports, and double-checked data entries. Her attention to detail quickly caught Lena's eye. You're really good at this, she said. Sophie smiled. Thanks. I guess I've had some practice. Around noon, the team took a short break in the lunchroom. It was a modest space with a few tables, a coffee machine, and a vending machine in the corner. The mood lightened as soon as Mark wasn't around. People laughed quietly, shared snacks, and swapped stories about clients and projects. Sophie joined them, trying to learn names and faces. She noticed how much lighter everyone seemed when the manager wasn't hovering. There was warmth among them. It just didn't seem to reach very far beyond this room. After lunch, things got busier. Emails were flying in, phones were ringing, and the sound of keyboards filled the air. Sophie stayed calm and steady, focusing on her tasks. Every now and then, she'd offer to help someone who looked overwhelmed. Some were grateful. Others seemed hesitant, maybe unsure if helping would slow them down. At one point, Lena leaned over and whispered, "You're doing great. But just a heads up, Mark doesn't like when people take initiative unless he tells them to. He thinks it's stepping out of line." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. That was interesting and concerning. Later in the afternoon, Mark reappeared. He walked straight through the department, scanning the desks. "How's the new girl doing?" he asked aloud. Sophie turned to face him. "I think I'm getting the hang of it," she said politely. He gave her a tight smile. "Good, just make sure you don't overcomplicate things. We do things a certain way here for a reason." "I understand," she replied calmly. He walked away, but she could feel his eyes on her as he left. By the end of the day, Sophie was tired but content. She had learned a lot already, not just about the work, but about the people. There was a quiet sense of fear under the surface, a culture of walking on eggshells, but there was also genuine talent among the staff. If only they were given a chance to speak up without worrying about getting scolded. As she packed up her things, Lena smiled at her again. "You survived your first day. That's a good sign," Sophie laughed softly. "It wasn't too bad. I've had worse. Just wait until you've been here a few weeks," Lena teased. "You'll have plenty of stories," Sophie smiled. But part of her wondered what kind of stories she'd hear, and what kind she might uncover herself. That night, back at home, Sophie sat down and wrote in her notebook. She had decided to keep daily notes just like her father used to do when he first started the company. It helped him stay grounded, he once said, and remember what mattered most. She wrote down everything, her first impressions, how people treated each other, what she noticed about Mark, and how the employees interacted when he wasn't around. She didn't write it as a report, but more like a diary entry, full of small details about tone, expressions, and energy. She wanted to capture the real picture, not numbers or graphs, but people. The next morning, she arrived early. The office was quiet, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air. She liked those few minutes before everyone else came in, the calm before the rush. Lena arrived soon after, surprised to see Sophie already there. "Wow, you're early. You'll make the rest of us look bad," she joked. Sophie laughed. "I just like to start fresh before things get busy." "Smart move," Lena said, settling into her chair. "You'll need that calm before Mark starts his rounds." As if on cue, Mark arrived about 10 minutes later, holding his coffee cup like a trophy. He gave a quick glance around the office and said, "Good morning, everyone. Let's make today productive." A few murmured greetings followed, but the room quickly went silent again. Sophie noticed how people's shoulders stiffened a little. It was like a switch had flipped. Throughout the day, Sophie quietly observed. Mark wasn't openly rude, but there was something dismissive about the way he spoke to people. He interrupted, corrected, and occasionally made sarcastic remarks that left employees uncomfortable. He seemed more focused on asserting control than actually supporting his team. At one point, an employee made a small mistake in a client report. Instead of calmly addressing it, Mark raised his voice in front of everyone. "We can't afford these kinds of errors. Pay attention next time." The office went silent. Sophie's heart sank watching the young man's face turn red. It wasn't the mistake that bothered her. It was the way Mark handled it. Leadership was supposed to guide, not humiliate. When Mark walked away, Sophie gently leaned over to the employee and said softly, "Hey, don't let it get to you. Everyone makes mistakes sometimes." The man gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, you're new, right?" "Yeah," she said. "Day 2. "Well," he said with a sigh, "you'll get used to it." But Sophie didn't want to get used to it. She wanted to understand it, and eventually change it. That evening, she wrote another long entry in her notebook. She noted how people avoided eye contact when Mark was around, how laughter disappeared the moment he entered the room, and how talented workers seemed unsure of themselves. She wrote that the company was still strong, but something in its heart had gone quiet. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Sophie kept working hard, learning everything she could, staying humble and quietly gaining the trust of her coworkers. They started opening up to her, sharing small stories. How Mark often took credit for their ideas, how he overlooked their efforts, how some had considered quitting but stayed for the sake of their teammates. Sophie listened without judgment. She wasn't here to expose anyone yet. She wanted to gather the full truth. She wanted to see whether the good could still outweigh the bad. One Friday afternoon, as the week came to an end, she overheard Mark talking on the phone in his office. His tone was sharp and impatient. "I'm running this place just fine," he said. "The owners don't need to know every little detail. They trust me." Sophie felt a small chill run down her spine. So that's how he saw it. Ownership as distance, not partnership. Control, not collaboration. When she left that day, she took a long look at the company sign again. Her father had always told her, "This business is about people, not profits." She now wondered if everyone in charge still believed that. She didn't know what the next few weeks would bring. But one thing was clear. She was going to find out exactly what kind of leader Mark was, and what kind of company her family business had become. And deep down, she promised herself something quietly but firmly. When the time came, she wouldn't let anyone disrespect the people who built this company from the ground up, not even a manager who thought he owned the place. As the sun set behind the glass building, Sophie smiled to herself. She might be just a new hire for now, but soon enough the truth would come to light. The next few weeks passed quickly for Sophie. She had started to blend in with the rest of the team, learning how things worked, helping where she could, and slowly earning the trust of her coworkers. On the surface, everything seemed fine, but underneath that surface, she could feel something off. The atmosphere was tense most of the time, and people seemed careful with every word they said, especially when the manager was around. Sophie didn't like to judge people too quickly, but Mark's behavior made it hard not to notice his arrogance. He was the kind of man who liked the sound of his own voice. Every morning he made his rounds like a king inspecting his castle, stopping by each desk just long enough to make people nervous. He liked being respected, but he confused respect with fear. One Monday morning, Sophie arrived a little earlier than usual. She enjoyed the calm before everyone else came in. It gave her time to think. She made a cup of coffee and sat down to review a client file. She didn't notice Mark had walked in until his voice broke the silence. "You're here early," he said, sounding surprised. "Yes," she replied politely. "I wanted to get a head start on some of the reports." He raised an eyebrow. "That's ambitious. Don't burn yourself out too soon." "I'll be careful," she said with a small smile. He nodded but lingered a little longer, as if trying to figure her out. Then he gave a short, forced laugh. "You remind me of myself when I started, eager to prove something." Sophie only smiled in response. She didn't want to say too much. She was there to learn, not to reveal herself. As the day went on, she noticed how Mark interacted with others. He liked giving orders more than listening. When someone came to him with an idea or suggestion, he would brush it off. "We've always done it this way," he'd say, as if that ended the discussion. Sometimes he even took credit for other people's ideas, repeating them later as if they were his own. It bothered Sophie to see how easily people gave up on sharing their thoughts. They had stopped expecting their voices to matter. At lunch, she sat with Lena and two other co-workers, Ben and Nora. They were laughing about something funny that had happened earlier that morning. It was one of the few times the office felt lighthearted. Then the door opened and the laughter died immediately. Mark walked in holding a folder. He wasn't smiling. Who was supposed to send the client file for the Peterson account? He asked. Ben swallowed hard. That was me, sir. I sent it last night. Well, it wasn't received, Mark said sharply. Now the client's complaining. Do I need to do everything myself around here? No, sir, Ben said quickly. I'll resend it right now. Mark sighed loudly. Next time, double-check before you leave. I don't like excuses. He turned and walked out, leaving the room silent. After a few seconds, Lena sighed. He could have just asked nicely. Ben gave a weak smile. That's just how he talks. I'm used to it. But Sophie could tell no one really got used to it. They just learned to live with it. That night, she wrote again in her notebook. She described how easily the mood in the office changed whenever Mark was near. She noted how fear had become normal there, how talented people had learned to stay quiet. She wrote about Ben's face when he got scolded, and how even small mistakes felt like major offenses. She wanted to believe Mark didn't mean to hurt anyone, that maybe he was under pressure. But the more she watched, the more she realized he enjoyed control. He liked being the person everyone had to please. One Wednesday afternoon, something unexpected happened. Mark called Sophie into his office. She stepped in carefully. You wanted to see me? Yes, he said, gesturing to a chair. Sit down, she did. I've been watching you, he said, leaning back in his chair. You're smart. You work fast. You actually pay attention to details, which is rare around here. Thank you, she said, surprised. He nodded. But I also noticed you're too quiet. You don't seem very social. You don't really talk to me unless I talk to you. Sophie kept her tone polite. I just focus on my work. I didn't want to overstep. He smirked slightly. Good answer. Still, you should try to loosen up. This team respects people who show confidence. You don't want them thinking you're afraid. I'm not afraid, she said gently. I just prefer to listen before I speak. Mark studied her for a moment, then gave a small chuckle. You've got a calm way of saying things. I like that. Keep it up and you might actually last here. Thank you, she replied again. Though inside she wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a warning. When she returned to her desk, Lena leaned over and whispered, What did he want? Just feedback, Sophie said softly. I think he's watching everyone closely. Lena rolled her eyes. He always does. It's like he enjoys catching people doing something wrong. Sophie smiled faintly. Maybe one day he'll catch someone doing something right instead. The rest of the week continued much the same. Mark's pattern was clear now. Praise one person, scold another, remind everyone that he was in charge. It was like a game of balance he played to keep people uncertain. Then something interesting happened the following Monday. During a meeting with the sales and admin teams, Mark was reviewing a monthly report. There was a problem with a client's billing that had caused confusion. Sophie had already noticed the issue earlier that morning, and quietly fixed it by double-checking the invoice data. When the topic came up, she raised her hand slightly. Actually, I looked into that earlier. The issue came from the wrong date format in the system. It's corrected now. Mark frowned, looking surprised. You fixed it? Yes, I confirmed with accounting. The room went silent. For a second, Sophie worried she had spoken out of turn, but then one of the sales staff smiled and said, That's great, Sophie. You saved us from a big delay. Mark cleared his throat. Well, good catch, he said quickly. But next time, bring these issues to me before making changes. We don't want confusion. Sophie nodded politely. Of course, but she could tell he wasn't pleased. Even though she had solved the problem, he didn't like that she had taken initiative without his approval. After the meeting, Lena whispered, You did amazing. That would have taken us hours to fix. Thanks, Sophie said quietly. But I think he's mad, Lena sighed. That's how it is here. If you make him look bad even by accident, you'll pay for it. That evening, Sophie stayed behind a little later to finish her tasks. Most people had already gone home. The lights were dim and the quiet hum of the office felt peaceful. She was deep in thought when Mark appeared again. You're still here? He asked. Yes, just wrapping up a few things, she said. He nodded slowly, stepping closer. You're a hard worker. I can see that, thank you. He paused. Just remember, I run this department. If you have ideas or want to fix something, come to me first. I like knowing what's happening in my office. Understood, Sophie replied calmly. He smiled faintly, then turned to leave. Good, keep up the work. Don't try too hard to impress anyone, especially not the higher-ups. They trust me to manage things here. After he left, Sophie sat back in her chair, her heart beating faster. That last sentence stuck with her. They trust me to manage things here. The way he said it sounded like a warning, or a claim of ownership. The next few days, Sophie noticed subtle changes. Mark became colder toward her. He stopped greeting her in the mornings. When she spoke during meetings, he interrupted her. When clients praised her work, he shifted the credit to himself. Once, when a client emailed directly to thank Sophie for her quick response, Mark forwarded the email to everyone with the message, "This is what happens when you follow my system correctly." Sophie stayed calm. She had expected something like this eventually. Still, it stung to be treated that way. She didn't want to create conflict, but she wasn't going to let him intimidate her either. One Friday afternoon, she was helping Nora organize files when she overheard Mark talking loudly in the hallway. "Some people think they're smarter than they are," he said. "Just because you fix a spreadsheet doesn't mean you understand business." Sophie looked up. She knew exactly who he was referring to. Nora gave her an uneasy glance. "Ignore him," she whispered. "He does that with anyone who stands out." Sophie nodded, forcing a small smile. But deep down, she was starting to see how serious the problem was. This wasn't just about one bad manager. It was about a culture he had created, one that rewarded silence and punished initiative. Over the weekend, Sophie met with her father for lunch. He didn't know she had already started her undercover work. To him, she was still taking time off after returning home. He talked about the company, about how proud he was of what they'd built, and how he trusted the current management to keep it running smoothly. Sophie listened quietly, feeling a pang of guilt. She didn't want to ruin his peace, not yet. She wanted the full picture before saying anything. When he asked if she had thought about joining the company officially, she smiled. "Maybe someday soon," she said. That Monday, something unexpected happened again. During a client presentation, Sophie noticed an error in one of the slides Mark was showing. It was small but could have caused confusion. She hesitated for a moment but then quietly pointed it out. "Excuse me, the date on that chart should be last quarter, not this one," she said softly. The client nodded, appreciating the correction. "Good eye," he said. Mark forced a smile, but his jaw tightened. "Yes, thank you, Sophie," he said through gritted teeth. "I was just about to mention that." After the meeting, his mood was icy. He didn't say a word to her the rest of the day. The following morning, she found a stack of new tasks on her desk, small, tedious assignments that usually went to interns. It was clear what he was doing. Lena looked at the pile and whispered, "He's testing you." "I know," Sophie said calmly. "It's fine. I'll handle it," and she did. She completed everything without complaint, double-checked each file, and even helped others finish their work when she was done. The team noticed. They admired her patience and kindness. Slowly, they began to confide in her more, sharing how long they'd been dealing with Mark's temper and control issues. One day, Ben said quietly, "You're the first person I've seen stand up to him, even in small ways." "Most people just keep their heads down," Sophie smiled gently. "Sometimes standing up doesn't mean shouting. It means staying calm and doing what's right." By the end of the month, the office dynamic had shifted slightly. People laughed a bit more when Mark wasn't around. They worked together better. But the moment his footsteps echoed down the hallway, silence fell again. Sophie knew it was only a matter of time before things came to a head. Mark's pride wouldn't let him ignore her progress for long, and she was right. One Friday morning, after weeks of quiet tension, Mark called her into his office again. His tone was cold this time. "Close the door," he said. She did. "I've been watching your behavior lately," he began. "You're doing good work, but I feel like you're getting too comfortable." Sophie met his gaze calmly. "I'm just trying to do my job well." He leaned forward. "You're overstepping. You correct me in front of clients, you make decisions without asking, and people are starting to look at you like you run the place." She stayed silent, letting him speak. "I don't know what your goal is here," he continued. "But remember this, I built this department. I earned my position, And I don't tolerate anyone trying to undermine me. I'm not trying to undermine you, she said softly. I just care about the work, he laughed bitterly. That's what everyone says. Just do your job, Sophie. Don't try to play hero. I'm not, she said quietly. But if something needs to be fixed, I'll fix it. That's my responsibility, too. He stood up suddenly, pacing. You really don't get it, do you? You're new. You don't tell me how things should be done. She met his eyes steadily. I'm just doing what I believe is right. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression hard. We'll see how long that attitude lasts. When Sophie left his office, her hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from frustration. She knew now what kind of man he really was. As she walked back to her desk, she made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't back down. She had come here to learn the truth, and now she had it. But she wasn't done yet. The time for patience was almost over. And though Mark didn't know it yet, every arrogant word he had just spoken would soon come back to haunt him, because the new hire he thought he could intimidate was far more powerful than he could ever imagine. The days that followed. That tense meeting between Sophie and Mark felt heavier. The air in the office was thick with something unspoken. People noticed the shift even if they didn't say it aloud. Mark's temper was shorter, his tone sharper. It was like he needed to remind everyone who was in charge, especially Sophie. Sophie stayed calm. She did her work carefully, smiled politely, and avoided unnecessary arguments. But deep down she knew things were heading toward a breaking point. It wasn't a question of if anymore, but when. On Monday morning, the week started quietly. The sound of keyboards filled the room. Sophie arrived early as usual, greeting her coworkers with a kind smile. Lena waved at her, whispering, "He's in one of his moods today." "Be careful," Sophie smiled faintly. "I'll be fine." Mark came in a few minutes later holding his coffee like always. He walked straight to his office without saying a word. The entire floor seemed to relax slightly once he closed the door. Around mid-morning, he called everyone for a short meeting. The staff gathered near the center of the office as he stood in front of them, arms crossed. "We've been falling behind on a few client reports," he began. "This is unacceptable. I expect everyone to double their effort this week." He glanced at Sophie when he said everyone, and she knew he was including her deliberately. Lena whispered under her breath. "We're already staying late," Mark continued. "If anyone can't handle the workload, let me know now. I'd rather replace people than tolerate mistakes." No one said a word. Everyone just nodded quietly. Sophie bit her tongue. It wasn't the time to argue. But she made a note in her mind, this wasn't leadership. This was intimidation. Later that day, Sophie was assigned to handle a new client project, one that required careful attention. She worked through the afternoon, checking every detail. It wasn't easy, but she enjoyed problem solving. When she finally completed the draft and sent it to Mark for review, she felt a small wave of relief. Maybe, just maybe, he'd appreciate the effort. But an hour later, he called her into his office. She walked in with her notebook in hand. "You wanted to see me?" He didn't look up right away. He was scrolling through her report on his computer. "You finished this fast," he said. "Yes," she said carefully. "I wanted to make sure we stayed on schedule." He leaned back in his chair. "It's fine, but you made a few changes to the structure." "Who told you to do that?" "No one," she said. "I just thought it would make the information clearer for the client." His expression hardened. "You thought. See, that's the problem. You're new here. You don't get to think about how we do things. You follow the system." Sophie's heart tightened, but her tone remained calm. "I was only trying to make it better." He stood up suddenly. "Better? You think you know better than me? I've been running this department for years. Don't you dare change my reports without my approval again." She stood there silently, letting him finish. He paced behind his desk, his voice rising slightly, but not enough to draw attention from outside. "I don't know what's gotten into you," he said. "You've been acting like you're some kind of supervisor lately. You need to understand your place here." Sophie's voice was quiet but steady. "My place is to do my job well. That's all I've been doing." Mark glared at her. "Then do it my way." She nodded calmly. "Understood." "Good," he said sharply. "Now go fix it." She turned and left without another word. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from anger. She had expected criticism, but the way he spoke down to her went beyond that. It was disrespect, plain and simple. Back at her desk, Lena looked up, worried. "You okay?" Sophie nodded. Just another talk. Everyone knew what that meant. The next few days were tense. Mark found small reasons to criticize her. A typo in an email. A delay that wasn't her fault, even the way she phrased client updates. It felt like he was trying to push her out. Still, she stayed professional. She smiled when she needed to. She kept working hard, but inside she was preparing herself. She knew this was building toward something big. By Friday, it finally happened. The morning started like any other. Sophie arrived early, organized her tasks, and began working quietly. Around noon, a client called asking about a missing document. Sophie checked immediately and found that the file had been saved incorrectly in the system. Something that wasn't her doing. But she fixed it quickly. Just as she finished sending the corrected file, Mark stormed out of his office. His face was red and his tone was sharp. "Who messed up the client upload?" he shouted. The room went silent. Sophie stood up slowly. "It was in the wrong folder, but I just fixed it." He turned toward her. "So it was you." "I didn't cause the issue," she said calmly. "But I fixed it as soon as the client called." He took a step closer. "You're always so quick to fix things, aren't you? Maybe if you didn't touch everything, things wouldn't break." "That's not fair," Sophie said softly. "I've been careful with every task." Mark laughed coldly. "Careful? You've been careless since you got here. You think you're smarter than everyone, but all you do is create problems." Lena stood up slightly. "That's not true," Mark snapped. "Stay out of it." Lena sank back down, her face pale. Sophie took a deep breath. "I'm sorry you feel that way, but I've been doing my best. You know that." He pointed toward the door. "Pack your things. You're done here." The entire office froze. Sophie blinked, thinking she had misheard him. "Excuse me?" "You're fired," Mark said coldly. "I've had enough of your attitude and your so-called improvements. I don't need people here who don't respect authority." The room went silent again. Every eye was on them. Sophie stood there, her heart pounding but her face calm. She could feel the shock in the air. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll gather my things." Mark smirked slightly, thinking he had won. "Good. HR will process your exit this afternoon. You can hand in your badge at the front desk." Sophie nodded slowly. "I'll make sure the co-owner hears about this." He laughed under his breath. "The co-owner? You think the board cares about one temporary admin worker?" "Don't make me laugh." Sophie gave him a calm look. Not angry, not afraid. "You'll find out soon enough." With that, she turned and began packing her things. The entire team watched in silence. Some looked angry, others sad. Lena's eyes were full of tears, but Sophie gave her a reassuring smile. "It's okay," she whispered. "Everything will be fine." She placed her notebook and pen in her bag, took one last look at the desk she had worked so hard at, and walked out with quiet dignity. Mark stood near his office door, arms crossed, watching her go with satisfaction. "Good luck finding another job," he muttered just loud enough for her to hear. She didn't reply. She just kept walking, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. When she reached the elevator, she pressed the button and looked back one last time. Through the glass walls, she could see her coworkers whispering quietly, glancing toward Mark's office. The tension was clear, not just about her leaving, but about what her firing said about the workplace itself. The elevator doors closed and Sophie finally exhaled. Her hands were steady now. It was done. That evening, she sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the notebook she had filled with weeks of observations. The unfair treatment, the disrespect, the fear. All of it written carefully, day by day. She smiled faintly. "Well, Mark," she whispered, "you just fired the wrong person." The next few days, the office buzzed with gossip. No one could stop talking about what had happened. Lena and Ben were especially upset. "She didn't deserve that," Ben said quietly as he filed papers. "She was the only one actually helping people." "I know," Lena sighed. "But you can't say that out loud. You know what he's like." Mark walked by and everyone went silent again. He was in an unusually good mood, humming as he carried his coffee. He seemed proud of himself, like he'd won a great victory. But what he didn't know was that the story wasn't over. Not even close. Later that week, an email was sent to all department heads announcing that the company's quarterly meeting would be held the following Monday. It was mandatory for all managers and senior staff, Mark saw the email and smiled. Finally, he muttered. A chance to show the board how well I've been running things. He spent the next few days preparing slides and charts, full of statistics that made him look good. He even told his assistant, "The owners are lucky to have me. Without me, this place would fall apart." Monday arrived quickly. The conference room was large and bright, filled with top executives and department heads. Everyone was dressed sharply, ready to present their updates. Mark entered confidently, his laptop tucked under his arm. He greeted the other managers and shook hands with the CEO, Sophie's father, without realizing who was sitting quietly beside him. Sophie. She was dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue suit, her hair neatly tied back. She looked calm, composed, and completely different from the new hire Mark thought he had fired. He froze for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Before he could speak, the CEO stood up and began the meeting. "Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce someone who has been working closely with us these past few months. My daughter, and co-owner of Langford Industries, Ms. Sophie Langford." A quiet murmur spread across the room. Mark's face turned pale. Sophie smiled politely at the team, her eyes calm but focused. "It's good to be here," she said. "I've had the chance to see the company from a very different perspective lately, and I've learned a lot." She didn't look directly at Mark yet, but he could feel the weight of her words. The CEO continued. "Sophie wanted to understand how our company culture truly operates. So she joined one of our departments quietly, without revealing who she was. We thought it would be an honest way to see how leadership is functioning." A wave of silence swept through the room. Mark's hand tightened around his pen. Sophie finally turned her gaze toward him, calm and steady. "What I saw was both inspiring and concerning. I met employees who cared deeply about their work, who helped each other and supported the company's mission. But I also saw fear. I saw a culture where people were scared to speak, where initiative was punished instead of encouraged." No one spoke. Mark tried to force a smile. "I'm sure there must be some misunderstanding." The CEO raised a hand, cutting him off. "There's no misunderstanding, Mark. We reviewed the reports, the complaints, and Sophie's notes. It's clear there are serious issues in your department," Sophie added softly, "including the way you treat your team." Mark swallowed hard. I didn't know." "No," Sophie said gently. "You didn't care to know." The silence in the room was deafening, and in that moment, everyone finally understood who Sophie really was. Not just a new hire, but the person who had come to restore the company's heart. Mark sat there, speechless, as the CEO announced that a full review of his management conduct would begin immediately. For the first time, Mark realized that the power he thought he had was never really his. It belonged to the company, and to the people he had underestimated. The meeting room stayed silent for several long seconds after the CEO's words. No one dared to move or speak. Even the sound of the air conditioner felt louder than usual. Mark sat stiffly in his chair, staring down at the polished table, his face pale and his confidence gone. Sophie looked calm. Too calm. Her eyes were steady, her tone soft, but every word carried weight. She wasn't angry. She didn't need to be. The truth itself was more powerful than any emotion. The CEO cleared his throat. "Before we move on, I think it's important to hear Sophie's observations. She spent weeks working alongside the staff, so she understands what's really happening in this department." All eyes turned to her. Sophie stood up slowly, her hands resting lightly on the table. "When I first joined the company," she began, "I wanted to see how it felt to be part of the team. Not as a manager, not as an owner, just as an employee. I wanted to understand what our people go through every day. What motivates them, what frustrates them, and what kind of leadership they're working under." She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "What I found was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Inspiring because I saw people who truly care about their jobs. They stayed late, helped each other, and even covered for mistakes that weren't theirs just to keep things running smoothly. But heartbreaking because those same people often worked in fear." Her eyes moved slowly toward Mark, though her expression remained composed. They were scared of making the smallest mistake. Scared of being yelled at, embarrassed, or blamed. Scared of losing their jobs. And fear is not leadership. It's control. It kills motivation, it silences creativity, and it drives away the very people who make this company great. The room was still. Even the other managers sat quietly listening. I met some wonderful employees, she continued. They told me stories about how they once loved their work, how they used to bring ideas to meetings, how they used to care deeply about company growth. But over time, they stopped speaking up. They learned that good ideas were ignored or punished if they didn't come from the top. She took a slow breath, her tone steady. I experienced that myself. I tried to offer suggestions to improve our client process, not because I wanted to show off, but because I wanted to help. Instead, I was told to stop thinking. I was told to know my place. I was spoken to as if my ideas had no value. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mark's hands were clasped together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Sophie looked down for a moment, then back up. When I was fired, I wasn't angry. I was sad. Sad because it showed me exactly what was wrong here. It wasn't just one bad moment, it was a pattern. A mindset that said power is more important than people. But that's not how this company was built. My father built it with respect, honesty, and teamwork. That's what made it strong. Her father, sitting beside her, nodded proudly. That's right, Sophie's voice softened. This company can't survive on fear. It can only grow through trust. That's what I want to fix. When she finished, the room stayed silent again. It wasn't the kind of silence that followed anger. It was the silence that followed truth. People were processing what they had just heard. The CEO turned toward Mark. Do you have anything to say? Mark swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. Finally, he said quietly, I didn't know who she was. I thought, that's the point, the CEO interrupted. You didn't have to know who she was to treat her with respect. Every person in this company deserves to be treated with dignity. Whether they're a new hire or an executive. Mark's shoulders slumped slightly. He looked down again, his confidence broken. Sophie didn't gloat. She didn't want revenge. She only wanted change. Her father continued, Mark, we appreciate your years here, but this kind of behavior doesn't align with our values. We'll be reviewing your management practices and interviewing your team members. Until then, you're suspended. The words hit hard. The entire room reacted quietly, some shocked, some relieved. Mark looked like the ground had disappeared beneath him. I understand, he said faintly. You can step outside, the CEO said firmly. Mark stood up slowly, gathered his papers, and left the room without another word. The door closed behind him, and for the first time in a long while, the air in the room felt lighter. Sophie sat back down. Her father gave her a small nod of approval. The meeting moved on to other topics, but everyone knew the most important discussion had already happened. After the meeting ended, several department heads came up to Sophie quietly. I just want to say, one of them whispered, thank you for doing that. We've been worried about that department for a while, but no one wanted to speak up. Sophie smiled kindly. Thank you. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Another manager added, it takes courage to see things from the ground level. Most people at your level would never do that. She shook her head. It's not courage, it's compassion. If we stop understanding our people, we stop being a real company. By the end of the day, word had spread throughout the building. Everyone knew now who Sophie really was and what had happened in that meeting. But instead of gossip, there was something else spreading. Hope. For the first time in a long time, employees felt seen. The next morning, Sophie arrived early. The front desk greeted her warmly, though this time with a bit more awe. She smiled, asking them to please just call her by her first name. When she stepped into the office where she had once been just the new hire, everyone froze. Lena's eyes widened in disbelief. Sophie, she whispered. Sophie smiled softly. Good morning, Lena. Lena stood up quickly, still unsure what to say. You're the co-owner? Sophie nodded gently. Yes, but that doesn't change what I said before. I'm still here to make things better. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ben, sitting at the far desk, stood up and started clapping. One by one, others joined in until the entire office was filled with applause. Sophie felt her chest tighten with emotion. She hadn't expected that reaction. She smiled, blinking back tears. Thank you, she said softly when the clapping stopped. But this isn't about me. It's about all of you. You deserve a workplace where you feel respected and supported. That's what we're going to build together. Lena stepped forward, her voice trembling. Thank you for standing up for us. We were too scared to say anything. Sophie reached out and squeezed her hand gently. You don't have to be scared anymore. For the rest of the morning, she spoke with each employee individually, listening to their concerns, asking for honest feedback. Some people admitted they had been thinking about quitting before. Others said they'd stopped caring about their work because they felt invisible. Sophie took notes, nodding, listening carefully. She didn't interrupt. She just let them speak. By noon, the office felt different. People smiled more. The tension that had lived in the corners of the room seemed to fade away. Lena looked around, whispering, "It feels peaceful," Ben chuckled. "It feels like we can finally breathe." Sophie smiled quietly, hearing their words. That was exactly what she wanted. Meanwhile, Mark sat alone in his apartment, staring at the suspension notice on his desk. His pride had been shattered. For years, he had built his reputation on being in control, on people fearing him. But now all of that had come crashing down in a single meeting. He thought about the way Sophie had looked at him, not with hatred, but with disappointment. Somehow that hurt more. He replayed the moments in his head, the way he had spoken to her, the way he'd humiliated her in front of everyone. The memory made him wince. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Regret. He realized that maybe he hadn't always been this way. When he first became a manager, he just wanted to do well. He wanted to prove himself. But over time, the pressure to maintain control, to look strong, had changed him. He started confusing fear with respect. Now, sitting in silence, he saw the truth. The next day, he decided to do something he hadn't done before. Take responsibility. He showed up at the office even though he was suspended. When the receptionist saw him, she looked surprised. "Mr. Mark, I know," he said quietly. "I just need to speak with Sophie for a moment if she'll allow it." Word reached Sophie quickly. Lena looked nervous. "You don't have to see him if you don't want to." Sophie thought for a moment, then nodded. "It's okay." "Let him in." Mark entered her office slowly, his expression humbled. He stood near the door, unsure of what to do with his hands. "Thank you for seeing me," he said quietly. Sophie gestured for him to sit. "Please." He sat down, taking a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. I was wrong. About everything. The way I spoke to you, the way I treated the team. It was unacceptable." Sophie listened silently. "I didn't know who you were," he continued. "But that shouldn't have mattered. You were right, I didn't care to know. I thought being strict meant being strong. But all I did was make people afraid. I see that now." His voice cracked slightly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Sophie nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you think." He looked surprised. "You're not angry?" "I was," she admitted softly. "But holding on to anger doesn't help anyone. What matters now is what you do next." He lowered his head. "I don't know what's next for me." Sophie smiled faintly. "Maybe start by listening. Real leadership begins when you listen, not when you command." He looked up at her, seeing something he hadn't expected. Kindness. "Genuine kindness, I'll remember that," he said quietly. Sophie stood and extended her hand. He hesitated for a second before shaking it. As he left the office, he felt lighter. He knew he had a long way to go to rebuild his reputation, but at least now he had taken the first step. Over the next few weeks, Sophie worked tirelessly with the staff. She organized team-building sessions, updated company policies, and started a new open voice program, where employees could anonymously share their thoughts or concerns. For the first time in years, people began smiling during meetings. Ideas flowed freely. Collaboration returned. One afternoon, Lena approached Sophie with a small box. "We all pitched in and got you something," she said shyly. Sophie opened it and found a simple plaque inside that read, "Thank you for seeing us." Her eyes softened. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you," Lena smiled. "No, thank you. You changed everything." Sophie looked around the office at the people laughing, working together, helping each other. This was what she had wanted all along. Later that evening, as she stood by the window overlooking the city, her father came by. "You did good," he said gently. Sophie smiled. "It wasn't just me. They did it too," he nodded. "That's what makes a great leader. You bring out the best in others." She looked out at the lights below. "I think we're finally on the right path." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder. We are. In the weeks that followed, Sophie's story quietly became a legend within the company. People spoke of the new hire who turned out to be the co-owner with admiration and respect. But what they remembered most wasn't the surprise, it was the message that leadership isn't about power. It's about people. That respect isn't earned through fear, it's earned through understanding, and that even the smallest voice in a company can carry the biggest truth. Sophie didn't need a title to prove who she was. She had already shown it through her actions, her patience, and her heart. And though the memory of that day in the meeting room would stay with everyone who witnessed it, it would no longer be a story of humiliation or anger. It would be a story of growth, humility, and change. Because sometimes the person you underestimate the most turns out to be the one who changes everything. Months passed since that unforgettable day when Sophie revealed who she really was. The company had changed, and slowly but deeply. It was like the air itself had shifted. Where there had once been tension, there was now lightness. Where people had once walked quietly, afraid to draw attention, they now talked, laughed, and shared ideas freely. The change wasn't magic. It took effort. It took patience. And it took trust. But Sophie stayed the same through it all, humble, approachable, and kind. She never once acted superior. Instead, she continued to walk through the office every morning, greeting people by name, asking how they were doing, and actually listening when they answered. It was small things like that which made the biggest difference. One morning, Lena sat by the window finishing her coffee before the workday began. Sophie walked by and stopped beside her. "Big day today?" Sophie said with a smile. Lena nodded, grinning nervously. "The new training program launch, yeah, I've been working on it for weeks." "I know," Sophie said warmly. "And I've read through your material. It's excellent. You've done something really special here." Lena blushed slightly. "Thank you. I just hope it goes well," Sophie smiled. "It will. You've got this." Moments like that had become normal now, where encouragement replaced fear, and support replaced blame. At 10 o'clock, the team gathered in the main conference area for the official launch of the Open Voice training program, an initiative that encouraged employees to share ideas, report issues safely, and even propose projects for company improvement. It was a program Sophie and the team had built together, based on everything they'd learned from the past. Lena took a deep breath and began her presentation. "When I started here, I used to keep my ideas to myself," she said, looking around at her coworkers. "I was scared of saying the wrong thing, but now, because of what we've built together, I don't feel scared anymore. I feel heard, and I want everyone to feel that way too." There was soft applause around the room. Sophie smiled proudly. Lena continued, explaining how the program would work. Monthly feedback meetings, suggestion boxes, team discussions, and even rewards for creative problem solving. It was clear she believed in it deeply, and her energy inspired everyone listening. When she finished, Sophie stood and spoke softly. "This program isn't just a project, and it's a promise. A promise that will never go back to being a place where people feel small or invisible. Every voice matters here. Every person counts." The room filled with applause again, louder this time. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was genuine. People felt proud. They felt part of something good. After the meeting, as the crowd dispersed, Sophie turned to Lena. "You did amazing," she said. Lena smiled shyly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Sophie shook her head. "You did this. You led it. I just gave you space." That, in truth, was Sophie's greatest gift. She gave people space to shine. A few days later, Sophie received an unexpected message in her inbox. It was from Mark. He hadn't been seen in months. After his suspension, he had taken time off to reflect and rebuild himself. Word around the company was that he'd gone back to school for leadership development courses, and had even started volunteering with a small business mentorship group. Now, his email was short and simple. "Hi, Sophie. I wanted to thank you again for how you handled everything. I've been working hard to change, and I'd like to speak with you if you're open to it. Mark." Sophie stared at the message for a few moments. Then she typed a short reply. "Of course. Let's meet tomorrow at 2 p.m. in the cafe downstairs." The next afternoon, she arrived early and took a seat by the window. The cafe was quiet, filled with the gentle hum of conversation and the smell of coffee beans. A few minutes later, Mark walked in. He looked different, calmer, more thoughtful. The sharpness in his eyes was gone, replaced by something humbler. "Hi," he said as he sat down. "Hi, Mark," Sophie replied kindly. He looked around awkwardly for a moment, then said, "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." "I believe in giving people chances," Sophie said. "That's how growth happens." He nodded slowly. "I wanted to apologize again. Not just for how I treated you, but for how I treated everyone. I thought I had to be tough to be respected. But all I did was make people afraid. You showed me what real leadership looks like." Sophie smiled gently. "It's not easy to admit mistakes." "I respect that you're trying," he sighed. "I've learned a lot since then. I started helping small businesses that were struggling with management issues. It's strange, but teaching others how to lead with empathy helped me understand everything I was doing wrong." "That's good to hear," Sophie said sincerely. "You're turning it into something positive." He hesitated, then said quietly, "I wanted to ask if there's ever a way back. Not necessarily to the same position, just a way to make things right." Sophie looked thoughtful. "You've already started making things right by changing. But as for coming back, let's take it one step at a time. There's no door closed to people who are willing to learn." He smiled faintly. "Thank you. I mean that." They talked for another half hour, not about the past, but about the future. When they finally stood to leave, there was a sense of peace between them. The bitterness was gone. As Mark walked away, Sophie felt something lift off her shoulders. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of what happened. In the following months, the company continued to grow. Productivity increased, employee turnover dropped, and client satisfaction reached new highs. But what truly made Sophie proud wasn't the numbers. It was the smiles. People smiled now, genuinely. There was laughter in the hallways. Teams collaborated naturally. Even small celebrations, like birthdays or project milestones, became moments of joy shared by all. One afternoon, the CEO called Sophie into his office. He was sitting by the window looking out over the city. "You've done something remarkable here," he said. Sophie smiled. "We've done it together," he chuckled. "Always humble. But don't downplay it. You've changed this place. You reminded everyone what leadership really means. I'm proud of you." She looked at him warmly. "Thank you, Dad." He stood and gave her a brief hug. "It's time people saw what you can really do. I'm planning to step back a little. I want you to take over more of the daily operations." She blinked. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "You've earned it. And besides, I think the company needs your kind of leadership now, not the old ways." Sophie felt a rush of emotion, but she smiled through it. "I'll do my best." "I know you will," he said proudly. A few weeks later, the company hosted its annual Employee Appreciation Day, a big event held in the courtyard with music, food, and speeches. It wasn't formal. It was warm, fun, and full of laughter. As people mingled, Sophie stood near the stage, holding a small card with her speech notes. She wasn't nervous, just thoughtful. When it was her turn, she walked up to the microphone. The crowd quieted immediately. "Hi, everyone," she began with a soft smile. "First of all, thank you. This day isn't about the company or the owners, Ian. It's about all of you. You're the reason this place exists, the reason it's alive." There were cheers and applause. When I first came here, not as the co-owner, but just as another employee, I saw how hard you all worked. I saw how much you cared even when it felt like no one noticed. And I promised myself that one day I'd make sure you were seen. The crowd grew quiet again, listening closely. Since then, we've built something together, something based on respect, kindness, and honesty. We've shown that work doesn't have to be cold or cruel to be successful. It can be human. It can be meaningful. She paused, scanning the faces in front of her. Lena, Ben, and so many others who had been there since the beginning. This company isn't perfect. It never will be. But it will always be a place that learns, grows, and listens. That's my promise to you. The applause that followed was loud and heartfelt. Some people even stood up, clapping with genuine emotion. Lena wiped a tear from her eye. "She did it," she whispered to Ben. "She really did it." Sophie smiled at the crowd and stepped off the stage, feeling a wave of warmth wash over her. She had never felt prouder, not because of her title, but because of what they had created together. Later that evening, as the sun set and the courtyard began to empty, Sophie sat alone on a bench, watching the last few employees laugh and pack up. The golden light painted everything softly, making the moment feel almost like a dream. Lena walked over and sat beside her. "You okay?" Sophie nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how far we've come," Sophie said softly. "It's hard to believe this is the same company I walked into a year ago." Lena smiled. "You changed it." "You changed all of us." Sophie looked at her kindly. "No, you all changed yourselves. I just reminded you how powerful you already were."